For years, one wedding photo did most of the talking. John F. Kennedy Jr. in his tuxedo, kneeling slightly to kiss the hand of his new wife on a dark porch in Georgia, both of them laughing like the world hadn't found them yet. That single image became shorthand for something bigger than a marriage. It became proof, in the public's mind, that even America's most watched family could still produce a fairy tale. If you're new here, this is the kind of story we dig into on this channel, so go ahead and subscribe now before we get into what that photo actually left out. Handsome, tragic, glamorous. The son of a slain president marrying a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread, because for a while, she had. People magazine called them the most eligible, most photogenic couple in the country before they'd even said their vows, and the story practically wrote itself. Once it was written, nobody wanted to revise it. Even after the crash that killed them both in 1999, the myth held together. Grief tends to freeze a story in its best possible shape, and this one froze right at the altar, forever young, forever in love, forever untouched by the ordinary wear that marriage puts on two people. Because the record left by friends, staff, and the people who watch this marriage up close tells a very different story than the one printed on magazine covers. It's not a story about betrayal in the tabloid sense. It's a story about two people who fell for each other fast, got married faster, and then spent almost 3 years absorbing a level of public pressure that very few marriages, of any kind, could have survived without cracking somewhere. Carolyn Bessette grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, the youngest of 3 daughters in a family that valued order and discretion over attention. Her father worked in finance, her mother taught school, and by most accounts the household ran on a kind of quiet, upper-middle-class normalcy, nothing like the chaos that would later follow her. She attended Greenwich High School, then went on to Boston University to study elementary education, an unusual starting point for someone who would eventually become one of the most photographed women in the country. Teaching didn't hold her attention for long. She drifted first into retail work, then into public relations, and by the early 1990s she had landed a position at Calvin Klein, working directly for the designer in the company's Manhattan showroom, eventually becoming head of publicity for the women's collection. People who worked with her there described someone who understood image without needing to perform it constantly. She had a minimalist personal style years before that became a marketing category on its own. Simple lines, muted colors, almost no jewelry, and colleagues said she could make an entire showroom go quiet when she walked through it, not because she was trying, but because she genuinely wasn't. That quality, the appearance of complete effortlessness, would later become both her signature look and one of the things the press fixated on most obsessively once she became a public figure. She met John Kennedy Jr. sometime in the early 1990s. Accounts differ slightly on the specifics. Some place the introduction at a gym in Manhattan, others through mutual friends in the city's downtown social scene. By 1994, they were dating seriously, and by most descriptions from people close to them, the relationship moved quickly from casual to consuming. Kennedy had dated well-known actresses and models before her, including a long relationship with actress Daryl Hannah that had stretched on and off for years. Friends said Carolyn was different, less interested in being seen with him and more private by instinct, which, according to several people who knew them both, was exactly what pulled him toward her. By 1996, John Kennedy Jr. was arguably the most photographed private citizen in the United States. He had spent his entire life under a camera lens, from the toddler saluting his father's casket to the shirtless jogger tabloids loved catching in Central Park. He understood surveillance in a way most people never have to learn. So when he decided to marry Carolyn, he didn't plan a wedding in the ordinary sense. He planned an operation, and he planned it with the same seriousness his family had once applied to actual political campaigns. The ceremony took place on September 21, 1996, on Cumberland Island, Georgia, a remote barrier island reachable mainly by boat, with no commercial airport and almost no realistic way for outside press to arrive without being spotted well in advance. Guests were told to pack for a weekend getaway without being informed it was a wedding until they were already on their way. Around 40 people attended, gathered inside a small wooden church originally built for formerly enslaved people after the Civil War, lit that night entirely by candlelight because the building had no electricity. It worked. Not one photographer captured the ceremony itself. The only images the public ever saw were the ones Kennedy's team chose to release afterward, including that now famous shot on the porch that would define how the world remembered them. For one night, John Kennedy Jr. did something almost no one in his family had managed before him. He controlled the narrative completely, down to the last detail. But that kind of control comes with a cost. and the cost came due almost immediately once the couple returned to New York. The secrecy surrounding the wedding only sharpened the public's appetite to see what came next, and what came next was a level of media pursuit that neither of them, despite everything Kennedy had already lived through, was fully prepared to absorb. After the wedding, John and Carolyn traveled to Turkey for their honeymoon, hoping the same secrecy that had protected the ceremony would extend a little further. It didn't, not entirely. Photographers eventually tracked them to the Turkish coast, and images from the trip ran in several publications within days, an early sign of just how difficult it would be for the couple to find any stretch of time that stayed fully theirs. Still, people who spoke with them shortly after described a genuine happiness in that first stretch of married life, a sense that they had pulled off something remarkable simply by getting married the way they wanted to. That early happiness ran alongside a steep learning curve. Carolyn was adjusting not only to marriage but to an entirely new category of public existence, one where her clothing choices were analyzed in fashion columns and her facial expressions in paparazzi photos were treated as evidence of her state of mind. She had spent her professional life helping other people manage their public image. Now she was living inside one that she had almost no control over, built by strangers with cameras rather than by her own choices. Friends said she leaned on a small circle of people she trusted completely during this period, including a few colleagues from her Calvin Klein years, treating that circle almost like a pressure valve, one of the only places where she didn't have to think about how she looked or sounded. They settled into a loft at 20 North Moore Street in Tribeca, and within weeks the address had become a fixture on the paparazzi circuit, the way certain restaurants or nightclubs become destinations unto themselves. Photographers didn't wait for tips anymore. They simply staked out the building, sometimes 10 or more of them at once, camping on the sidewalk from early morning until Carolyn or John left for the day, then following on foot, on bicycles, occasionally on scooters weaving through Manhattan traffic just to keep pace with a taxi. Carolyn had not grown up in front of cameras the way her husband had. She had spent her 20s in a business, fashion public relations, where staying slightly out of the frame was part of the job description. Marrying Kennedy inverted that completely, and friends who later spoke to journalists described a woman who found the transition far more disorienting than she ever let on publicly. She was seen, on multiple occasions caught on film, visibly shaken leaving the apartment, at one point photographed crying on the sidewalk outside their building as a crowd of photographers closed in around her. Another widely circulated clip from 1997 shows her distressed in Central Park, with John trying to physically shield her from the cameras while telling photographers to back off and give them room. These were not isolated incidents. According to people who worked near the couple at the time, the pursuit was close to constant, and it did not ease with time the way both of them reportedly hoped it might, once the initial excitement of the wedding faded. If anything, the intensity increased, because every visible sign of strain the cameras managed to catch became more valuable to the tabloids than a routine photo of two people simply walking down a street. Distress sold papers, and distress was increasingly what the cameras were finding, week after week, outside a building that had briefly seemed like a fortress. The public image of the marriage stayed remarkably consistent through its first year or so. Behind it, according to several biographers who interviewed friends, staff, and associates of the couple in the years that followed, a very different picture was forming. Multiple people close to Carolyn later told reporters that she confided feeling trapped, not by her husband exactly, but by the machinery that surrounded him, the security details, the constant vigilance required just to step outside, the sense that her own identity was steadily being absorbed into his in a way she hadn't fully anticipated on that porch in Georgia. There were also reports, never confirmed by either family, that Carolyn had grown unhappy enough at certain points to discuss separation with people close to her. The author Christopher Anderson, who researched the marriage extensively for a book published a few years after their deaths, wrote that friends described a relationship marked by real love but also real volatility, arguments that spilled into public view more than once, including a heated exchange outside their building in August of 1996, weeks before the wedding even took place, that was caught on camera and printed in several tabloids at the time. Anderson's reporting, along with accounts from other biographers, suggested Carolyn had at least explored the idea of a divorce lawyer during a particularly difficult stretch, though this specific detail has never been independently verified and should be treated as a disputed claim rather than settled fact. None of it proves the marriage was failing in any permanent sense. Plenty of marriages survive serious fights and real strain, but it does complicate the image sold to the public at the time, an image with no visible room for tension of any kind. Some biographers also described Carolyn struggling with the isolation itself, describing periods where she pulled away from her own circle of friends, in part because meeting them in public risked drawing the same swarm of photographers that followed her everywhere else. Seeing people she loved became, in a strange and specific way, a security risk. Friends said she sometimes chose to simply stay inside rather than deal with the exposure that even a quiet lunch date could invite into her day. If you're finding this rundown useful, this is a good moment to hit that subscribe button because we're only halfway through, and the parts of this marriage the magazine covers never showed you are just getting started. While Carolyn was adjusting to a life under constant watch, John was running George, the political and culture magazine he had launched in 1995, with considerable fanfare and a cover featuring a supermodel dressed as George Washington. The premise was ambitious, politics covered with the tone and visual style of a lifestyle glossy, and early issues sold well on the strength of Kennedy's name and the novelty of the concept. By 1997 and 1998, though, circulation had begun sliding, advertisers were pulling back, and reports at the time described growing tension between Kennedy and his business partner over the magazine's direction and its worsening finances. Running a struggling publication while living under the kind of scrutiny his marriage attracted meant John was pulled in several directions at once, and colleagues at George later described him as increasingly stretched thin, present at the office some days and largely absent on others as the pressure from both parts of his life compounded. This mattered for the marriage because it often meant Carolyn was navigating the public pressure largely on her own, without her husband physically present to run interference with photographers the way he had during those earlier incidents in Central Park. Money itself was not really the issue. Both of them had resources most people never will, but the professional pressure building on John compounded the personal pressure already sitting on Carolyn, and according to people close to them, the two stresses fed each other in a fairly predictable way. A bad week at the magazine meant John came home distracted or short-tempered. A bad week with the press meant Carolyn came home rattled and withdrawn. Neither of them, by most accounts, was especially skilled yet at managing the other person's version of a hard day, which is honestly true of most young couples early in a marriage. Except most young couples get to work that out privately, without a paying audience following every step of the process. There was another layer of pressure that had nothing to do with photographers, and everything to do with the family Carolyn had married into. John Kennedy Jr. was, by 1996, effectively the most visible living member of one of the most scrutinized families in American political history. His mother, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, had died in 1994, and with her passing, much of the public's attention that had once been split across the wider Kennedy family concentrated more heavily on John, the son who had grown up almost entirely in public view and who many assumed would eventually enter politics himself. Carolyn stepped into that role without the years of preparation most people who marry into political dynasties are given. She had dated John for a couple of years, but nothing fully prepares a person for family gatherings surrounded by extended Kennedy relatives, some of them elected officials, all of them accustomed to a level of public exposure that had shaped their entire lives from childhood. Several accounts describe her as reserved at large family events, more comfortable in small groups, and not particularly interested in the political ambitions that so many people around her assumed John would eventually pursue. That mismatch, not dramatic but persistent, added yet another layer to an already complicated adjustment, one where she was expected to fit into a role that had never been fully explained to her and that she had never really auditioned for in the first place. By the summer of 1999, people close to the couple described the marriage as having settled into something steadier than its rockier early stretches, though still far from the untroubled fairy tale the public continued to imagine. Carolyn had reportedly begun spending more time again with her own friends, and some who spoke with her that summer described her as cautiously optimistic, discussing future projects and considering work of her own again after several years spent largely defined by her husband's public life and career. On July 16th, John was scheduled to fly Carolyn and her sister Lauren Bessette from a small airport in Fairfield, New Jersey, to Martha's Vineyard, where the extended Kennedy family was gathering for the wedding of his cousin, Rory Kennedy. He had earned his pilot's license about a year earlier and had logged roughly 300 hours of flight time, most of it without an instructor present, and very little of it at night or in poor visibility conditions. That evening carried both. Haze had settled thickly over the water off the Massachusetts coast, dense enough to blur the horizon entirely, a condition experienced pilots know can trigger spatial disorientation, where the body's inner sense of up and down stops matching reality, and a pilot can enter a steep descent without ever realizing it's happening. The flight departed later than originally planned, close to 9 in the evening. Radar data recovered afterward showed the aircraft, a Piper Saratoga, descending steadily before entering a spiral consistent with exactly that kind of disorientation. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board later concluded that the probable cause was pilot error brought on by the combination of haze, darkness, and Kennedy's limited experience flying at night without a visible horizon to orient himself. The plane went down roughly 7.5 miles off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, close to midnight. There was no distress call recorded and no warning that anything had gone wrong. Search and rescue operations began the next morning once the family reported the plane overdue, and for days the story dominated every news outlet in the country, a national vigil playing out in real time as Coast Guard vessels searched a wide stretch of ocean for any sign of wreckage. The bodies of John Kennedy Jr., Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy, and Lauren Bessette were recovered 5 days later by Navy divers, still strapped into the submerged wreckage roughly 160 feet below the surface. All three were cremated, and their ashes were scattered from a Navy ship into the waters near where the plane had gone down, a burial at sea consistent with a tradition the Kennedy family had used before. Carolyn was 33 years old. She had been married for just under 3 years, and the wedding she had spent so much effort trying to keep private ended, in the end, being remembered by nearly the entire country. Because no bodies could be buried in the traditional sense, there was no funeral in the conventional format most families hold. Instead, a memorial mass was held on July 22, 1999, at the Church of St. Thomas More on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, the same church where John had once served as an altar boy as a child. Around 300 people attended, including surviving members of the Kennedy family, friends from Carolyn's years in fashion, and colleagues from George magazine. Senator Edward Kennedy delivered a eulogy for his nephew, describing him as a man who could have avoided the family's tradition of public service entirely, but chose instead to try, in his own way, through journalism rather than elected office. Less was said publicly that day about Carolyn specifically, which some of her own friends later described as its own kind of quiet injustice, a woman who had spent 3 years trying to protect a version of privacy that almost nobody else in her husband's family had ever been allowed to keep, largely absorbed, even in death, into a service built primarily around her husband's name and legacy. In the immediate aftermath, almost nothing critical was said publicly about the marriage. That's a common pattern after sudden, widely mourned death, and it's an understandable one. Nobody wants to complicate a national moment of grief with stories of tension and strain. But in the years that followed, as biographers gained access to friends, staff, and associates who were willing to speak more candidly once the rawest period of mourning had passed, a fuller and considerably more complicated picture began to emerge, the one this video has been walking through. None of what surfaced afterward erases the fact that John and Carolyn loved each other, by every credible account, deeply and genuinely. Friends consistently described real affection between them, private jokes, protectiveness, the kind of connection that doesn't convincingly fake itself for 3 straight years in front of people who knew them well and would have noticed. What the later reporting complicates is the idea that the marriage was somehow immune to ordinary pressure, that being glamorous and photogenic and wealthy meant being exempt from the difficulty of building a life with another person. It wasn't immune. If anything, the fame made the ordinary difficulty harder, because a fight that would stay private for most couples became tabloid material for theirs, and a bad week couldn't simply be a bad week. It had to be processed under the constant assumption that someone with a camera might already be watching, waiting, ready to sell whatever they caught. That wedding photo on the porch in Georgia is still the image most people picture the moment they hear Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy's name. It's a beautiful photo, and the moment it captured was real. But a single evening, however joyful, was never going to be the whole story of a marriage that unfolded almost entirely under public observation, in an era before social media existed to make that kind of scrutiny feel routine and expected. What their friends, their biographers, and the couple's own occasional lapses in front of running cameras eventually revealed was a relationship attempting something genuinely difficult, trying to stay private while belonging, whether either of them wanted it or not, to the public. Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy is often remembered mainly as a style icon, a woman whose minimalist wardrobe still shows up on fashion mood boards decades after her death. That's part of her story, but it isn't the most honest part. The more honest part is a young woman who fell in love quickly, married into one of the most watched families in American history, and spent the final 3 years of her life trying to hold on to some version of herself while millions of strangers watched her attempt it in real time. The love story was real. It just was never the simple, uncomplicated version the magazines sold at the time, and the record left behind by the people who actually knew her makes that difference clear. Understanding that doesn't diminish what they had together. If anything, it makes their 3 years married a little more human, two people trying to build something ordinary in circumstances that were anything but, and mostly succeeding, right up until the night neither of them got the chance to grow old inside the life they'd chosen. If this kind of deeper look into the stories behind the headlines is something you want more of, subscribing is the best way to catch the next one.